Look, for Qatar, it's an absolute escalation. It's the first time in Qatar's history that we've had a military strike in the country. It has also been an escalation, I think, beyond what was mostly expected. Obviously, Al Udeid was prepared for this strike. But I think we have to bear in mind that from the different scenarios that, or the courses of action that Iran could have chosen today to retaliate against this US strike on Fordow yesterday, they've chosen not necessarily the minimum sort of course of action. They used something in the middle. I think a minimum one would have been striking a base in Iraq. We also have to understand that Qatar plays a very important role. I mean, it has been a mediator, back channel for Iran, talking to the United States. It still plays a pivotal role in mediating this potential nuclear deal between the United States and Iran. It shares the greatest gas field with Iran and has helped the Iranians in this respect. So to strike Qatar was certainly an escalatory step beyond what was necessary. It was obviously choreographed, it was telegraphed, but it wasn't necessarily coming with the same kind of warning that we would have anticipated. So it wasn't a warning that came a day in advance and the countries could prepare for it. It was a very short warning in that respect. So it is certainly a major escalation. But from what we hear now from the IRGC, they say from their side, this is the end of it. The Americans seem to suggest this could be the end of it, which would be great. It would be a tit for tat, and that's the end of that sort of escalation. The question is whether Trump will take it as such, or whether he wants to take some additional steps, which would be really, really bad.
Okay.
But from a Qatari point of view, this is something the Qataris can and did sustain, and I think the air defense did quite a good job and showed also that they're capable to actually intercept these incoming missiles. For the past week or so, since the Americans decided to or playing around with the idea of getting involved in this war, Al Udeid was basically freed of any soldiers. Material was flown out. We also knew that the Iranians were playing with the idea of striking Al Udeid, and so the Qataris kind of knew by midday that the Iranians were serious about striking Al Udeid, but it was still not a lot of warning time. We also know the Qataris have also built their air defenses in a way to protect Al Udeid, to intercept the strike, so they were well prepared for that. But I think what is important to bear in mind as well is, so after Israel has taken out some of the leadership of the IRGC and the defense sort of security establishment in Iran, we have now a new generation of people coming in who might have to show that they mean business. They also need to try to desperately try to reestablish some sort of deterrence that Iran has somewhat lost over the course of the last year and a half, if you will. And so I think that's why they didn't go for the minimum sort of strike, symbolic strike on a base in Iraq, but went for a step further, striking Qatar directly, the most important base of the US in the Middle East. So, minimal impact, but I think the show of force, the message that came with it is an escalation beyond what was necessary. I agree with Omar. I mean, it's something that sends a strong message, and the Iranians are saying, we mean business, don't retaliate now. Well, we should also bear in mind that this is a Qatari base. This is not just some remote place that is an American entity. I mean, this is primarily a Qatari base that also hosts UK forces, US forces, and other forces from other nations. So it was very much a hit on Qatari sovereignty and territory. Qatar is a peaceful country. Qatar has a long history of being a mediator. Diplomacy is the lever of power of statecraft that Qatar has always used, especially in the last 30 years. The military is obviously strong. It's meant to be a deterrent. It's meant to be a defensive sort of force. So we don't expect Qatar to use the military. Obviously, it sent a very strong message back to Iran. But really what Qatar wants is not further destabilization. It's very different from Israel, that obviously responds with further escalation in a sort of eye for an eye approach. I think what Qatar is trying to do is trying to use this as a potential diplomatic off-ramp, because behind the scenes, what we haven't talked about is that Qatar has obviously been hosting talks and back channels between the Americans, between Witkoff and the Iranians, between the Americans and the Iranians, trying to build a nuclear deal that can actually hold. And from what I'm hearing now, we might get slightly closer to this, where there is a position that both the Iranians and also the Americans could agree on. And if this is the end of this spiral of escalation and Trump leaves it as it is, then we might actually now have a pathway to a diplomatic deal. So I think that's what the Qataris are really hoping for. Well, I agree with Mahran. I think Trump has no real interest in escalating. He shouldn't, at least. I think the MAGA crowd is putting a lot of pressure on him anyway. Those people who say America first, say don't escalate. We don't want a prolonged, protracted conflict. The big problem here isn't necessarily Trump. I'm more concerned about the Israelis. The Israelis are the ones who really pushed Trump down that corridor, and they have been forcing his hand by unilaterally striking Iran. And I think that the Israelis also have an interest in kind of creating a rift and driving a wedge between Iran and the Gulf states. I think that's also very important. And the Iranians have somewhat fallen in line. The Iranians, by attacking Qatar, have somewhat doing the step that Israel wanted them to do, which is kind of escalating and trying to drive a wedge between the Gulf and Iran. And so the Israelis, and we're seeing that on social media right now, there are a lot of talking heads, pro-Israeli talking heads, who are now trying to exploit this to kind of push a narrative of saying, look, we always told you the Iranians are bad. Maybe you should be siding with us and maybe normalize with Israel. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But the Israelis are a very, very influential force in this. And I'm a bit worried that they might find another way to keep Trump engaged.
Omar Rahman, Middle East Council on Global Affairs, your fellow there.
Now, look, this is the U.S.-Iranian standoff is a smaller part of the Israeli-Iranian standoff, which is a bigger part or a smaller part of the much bigger Israeli attempt to restructure the regional order with itself somewhat in the driver's seat. And so it's a small tactical victory, I think, especially now reading the news from Washington that Trump seems to be happy with what was achieved. The Iranians seem to be happy with what was achieved. But the big problem here is that ultimately, and that's as sad as it sounds, ultimately it's up to the Secretary of State Netanyahu, if you will, to make the decision of what's going to happen next. He's been the one who's been driving it. He's been driving the war into Lebanon. He's been driving the war into Syria. He's been driving the war into Iran. And he's been able to drag two administrations with him. And he's certainly been able to manipulate Trump into this war. Now, how strong is Trump to actually keep the neoconservatives in Washington in check? That's the big question mark, to actually sell this as a victory and say we've achieved what we wanted to achieve. And if the Israelis are not happy with what they achieved, so I agree there, if the Israelis think that regime change is necessary or the hollowing out of the regime is necessary, that means that a deal cannot be had. And so, you know, I'm fairly positive now. I'm much more positive now than I was this morning about the situation. But there is this longer term sort of implication of the question of where does it lead us, and where is Trump stable enough to actually deliver on what he's saying, or is he just being manipulated again by the Israelis? The Americans now, and that's very important, the Israelis have no strategy for what they want in the Middle East. They want chaos, and they're sowing chaos, but they're also not really building anything. They're destroying without building. In their point of view, they would love to keep everything in limbo. That's not what the region wants. That's not what Trump should want. So Trump needs to put his foot down. He needs to use all the levers at the U.S. Table to put pressure on the Israelis to make sure that they're falling in line now.